Hi again. So now we're going to move into population geography, a very important topic that we'll be talking about throughout the course. I do have an exercise that I'm going to put onto Canvas for you guys to complete. It's not for a grade, but it's for you to complete, and then those things will appear on the exam. All right, so population geography. We're going to look at where people are concentrated and why. Why are places growing or declining and why? And what's the future of population growth in the world? And again, we noted in the previous lecture about how many people live on the earth and what's going to happen in the future. So let's talk about population concentrations. There's 5 basic concentrations that we have. One is in East Asia. About 25% of the world lives in places like China and Japan, the Korean Peninsula. We also have about 25% that live in South Asia, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. We also have about 8% of the world that lives in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. And then in Europe, it's about 5%. So one thing that you really should note is that here in the US, we have 5% of the world's population. We're a very small amount of it. So 95% of the world is outside of our borders. And you guys should take that into account that the rest of the world, there's much more people and cultures and things outside of what we know here in the United States. Now, looking at population growth, historically, the majority of the world's population before 10,000 BC they were basically hunters and gatherers. And we had very small populations. So about 8,000 BC, we had maybe 500 million people in the world for humans. It's amazing. And then as we see over time, the Industrial Revolution really changed that. And we see an exponential growth that's been happening since, especially in our livelihoods. So every year, 75 million people are added to the world's population. Every month, 6 million. Every day, 203,000 people are added to the world's population. And then just a couple other ones every hour, 8,000 people, 8,500 minute, 141 people are added to our population. And every second, 2.4 people are added to our population. Now, while that's an exponential growth curve in terms of population that's been going on, it's been slowing down. I remember teaching this class 20 years ago, and all the data is so different now because it's really slowed down. You don't have to know these numbers, so don't worry about that. It's just for effect. So, how does a population increase? It's pretty simple. It's like basic biology. And we look at the crude birth rate. That's the number of children that are born for every 1,000 people in your population in a year. And the reason that we look at that is that the rate, we're not looking at the number of people, we're looking at the rate. So a place like Jamaica, for example, would have a slower rate than, Niger. So the number of kids might be higher, but you can't really compare them. So by the rate, we can compare places. And I'm putting up here 2 examples that are kind of on either end of the spectrum. Niger, which is in Central Africa, they have about 45 births per 1,000 people every year. Germany has only 9. So now we can compare the rate. Now, another thing we can look at is total fertility rate. That's the number of children that a woman will have during their lifespan. And that's the total fertility rate. In Niger, on average, a woman will have 6.6 kids in their lifetime. In Germany, it's 1.4. An important thing to understand about this is that basically it's about 2.1 is replacement level. So if you're a family and you have a father and mother, if you have 2 children, they replace the mother and father. and that's replacement rate. So if you have 6.6, that's going to be growing. 1.4 by Germany means that they're not having enough children to replace their population. Another thing about population growth is immigration, people moving in and out, and that's going to be a topic coming up later. So some places have net migration of positive migration and others have negative, and we'll talk about that. Now, in terms of crude birth rate, we can see this here. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have much higher crude birth rates. In the rest of the world, it's actually really declining. We have some exceptions in like Indonesia and Iraq, Central America. But for the most part, the crude birth rate's really going down, but it's much higher in sub-Saharan Africa. Fertility rate goes along pretty much similar to that one. And you can see in sub-Saharan Africa, we have much higher ones where we have fertility rates of over 4 kids a person, up to 6, 7 kids. And there are some exceptions, like in Iraq, Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, and etc. But most places, the birth rates are really coming down. The fertility rates are really coming down. Now, in terms of population growth, how do populations decrease? And that's the crude death rate, the same thing that we said with the crude birth rate. So crude birth rate is the number of kids that are born per 1,000 people, and crude death rate is the number of people that die per 1,000 people. So in Niger, we can see that it's 12 per 1,000. In Germany, it's the same. It doesn't mean that Niger has a better medical system than Germany. It's just about the structure of their society. Infant mortality is also very important. That's the amount of kids that are born within 1 year that will die within 1 year. So in Niger, it's about 83 per 1,000. It's at 8.3%, basically, if you do the calculations, that will die. Now, it used to be much higher. It used to be 25% when I was talking about this 20 years ago, but it's come down because of increased healthcare. In Germany, it's very low. Now, under age 5 mortality, this reflects the idea of how many kids will make it to 5 years of age. And so for Niger, 13% of kids will not make it to 5 years of age. In Germany, it's pretty much it's not much. And that reflects healthcare. So Niger does not have the best healthcare, and so they have a much higher mortality rate. And then, of course, for population growth, we can talk about immigration, people leaving and moving to another place. So looking at crude death rates, we see that it's somewhat elevated in sub-Saharan Africa. It's also higher in Europe. And the reason for this is that the structure of their society, in terms of how many people are young, they're not having many kids, but now you're having a lot more older people. And older people tend to die more than younger people. And so you see an elevated range for crude death rates in other countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's related to disease. Infant mortality rate, that's really related to healthcare. And you can see in sub-Saharan Africa, it's much more elevated. We also see it in Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. And that's access to healthcare. So how do we look at how populations grow or decline? And that's a natural increase rate. And basically, it's the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. And then we convert that to a percentage. So, for example, in Niger, the natural increase rate is 3.3%. Now, that doesn't mean much to most of us when we look at the number, but that's very high. That means that if they continue at that rate, their doubling time will be 21 years. We have a rule called the rule of 69, and you guys will calculate that on our exercise. So you take the number 69, it's about based on kind of exponential growth rates, and you divide that by that growth rate. So if they continue growing at 3.3%, they will double their population in 21 years. That's fast. But note the life expectancy is only 56 years. For Germany, they actually have a negative one. They have more people dying than are being born. So they're negative. Same thing with places like Japan and some other place, Italy, etc. So their doubling time is actually negative 230 years, which means that their population would have in 230 years as long as they can continue that same growth rate or negative growth rate. But of course, in Germany, the life expectancy is over 81 years. I believe it's actually higher now. So just, again, these are kind of both ends of the spectrum, and there are some that are above and beyond. So looking at natural increase rate, if it's above 2%, it's high growth. And that's the red that we see. And mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, some in Central America, although that's coming down very quickly. We see some in Central Asia, Afghanistan and Pakistan, we can do Iraq and Syria, but that changes every year. And an important thing is looking at the percent of your population that's young, under the age of 15. These are children that are going to eventually have their own kids. And so if you look at this, 40% and above in sub-Saharan Africa are under the age of 15. So there's a momentum built into population growth based on the fact that you have so many young people that are about to have their own children. And you can see that in sub-Saharan Africa. So even if you stop policies and just not having any kids, it's going to continue for another 20, 30 years. Now, another thing that we look at is population pyramids. This helps us understand how things are going and what they're going to have go in the future. So this is a population pyramid for Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And you see it's, basically on the left-hand side, you have the males, the right-hand side, you have females. Of course, the reason for that is females are always right, as my wife likes to say. So basically, the people up here are having these kids. So if it's looking flat, like it used to be growing, but when it becomes flat, that means that the population is not growing. It's pretty much stable. They're not going to grow. This is from Naples, Florida, inverted pyramid. And you can see, wow, there's a lot of old people and not many young people, especially in your age bracket. And that's because it's a retirement community. So people come in, but this is indicative of a declining population. If you have an inverted pyramid, that means the population is not growing. These people are not having children. So you're not going to have growth. This is Laredo, Texas. This is a population pyramid that looks like it's growing. If it looks like a pyramid, it's growing. And that's a border town, a lot of immigrants coming in, and that creates a positive growth rate. And in many countries around the world, you'll see that. So if it looks like a pyramid, population's growing. Whereas in Naples, that's declining. Then we have some other interesting ones. This is Lawrence, Kansas. If you don't know anything about Kansas, this is a university town, University of Kansas. So your age group has a whole lot of people, men and women. It's kind of normal, except that we have that expansion because it's a college community. This is in Alaska, Unalaska, and that's a really weird looking population pyramid. And the reason is because it's an Air Force base. So you have a lot more males coming in to work during that working age population. You do have some female as well on that side, but it's a very awkward population pyramid based on just the local economy and where people are. So let's go to the demographic transition. It's a really important topic. You guys should pay special attention to it. And I want you on your notes that you're taking to go stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Write those down. So this is the way that populations change over time as places develop and change. So stage 1, no country in the world is in stage 1, but this is like most of human history. So going up to 10,000 BC, basically almost all populations were in this stage 1. They were hunters and gatherers and this, birth rates and death rates and growth rates is what we see on this one. So basically, during that time period, you had a lot of people die. Most people lived to like 30, 40 years of age. During good years, you might have an increase in population. During bad years, like drought or something like that, it'll drop. But it goes back and forth, and the death rates are really high. We didn't have modern medicine and all those things. So the population remained pretty much stable. An interesting number is that for the human history, for all our time that humans have been here, of the 80 billion people that ever lived on Earth, 90% were hunters and gatherers, and they didn't live that long. So the natural increase is very low. So stage 2, only a few countries are in stage 2, a few in sub-Saharan Africa pretty much, but most countries are past that. But basically the death rate drops. We have medicine that stops people from dying. We have better nutrition, the Industrial Revolution, and all those things created positive things for populations. So less people died, but they kept having the same amount of kids. So in stage 2, our populations exploded. Now, this was big in Europe and North America in the 1800s. And then it spread into places like Latin America in the early 1800s, and then into places like Africa in the 1900s. So at that point, the birth rates are declining just because of medical advancements and sanitation and better, water supplies. But then at some point, people start having less kids. And that's the birth rate. And as the birth rate goes down, the natural increase rate goes down. And that's due to a lot of things. One is urbanization as people move to urban areas, and having children is less positive when you live in an urban area. If you're in a rural area, kids are actually working on the farm. They actually are positive, economic positive. But when you get to the urban areas, they become not so. You have to provide for them. And multiple reasons. We'll talk about that later as we go through the course. But people start having less kids, natural increase rate goes down. This happened in the United States and Europe, especially in the 1800s and 1900s, and then it shifted into like Latin America and Africa and Asia later on in the 1900s. Stage 4 is when the birth and death rates equal out. So we're seeing no growth. That's where the United States is right now. Places like Mexico are getting close to that, etc. And so the birth and death rates, and so we don't see population growth based on natural increase, only based on migration. And then stage 5, that's the newest one. The death rates actually go up. Of course, the birth rates kind of stay the same. And this is like Japan, Italy, Germany, many places. And the reason for this is that the structure of your society has gone from having a lot of kids to having a lot of older people. And as I mentioned, older people tend to die a bit more than young people. So the death rate goes up, not because that there's bad healthcare, it's because of the structure of the population. You don't have as many children, and you have a lot more elderly people. And that's where we start seeing declining populations. Like I said, Japan, Italy, Germany, Singapore, a few, and South Korea. And the United States is kind of right on that, right in the middle there on stage 4 to 5. So I want you to make sure to take special appreciation of the demographic transition. It'll come throughout the course. So make sure that you really understand these different stages and why and what's going on. Now, here's the issue. Is a declining population a problem? So when you have a lot of young people, you have to take care of them. That's education. Think about healthcare for young people, etc. But if you suddenly have less young people, but you have more older people, what does that mean? And here's Japan. This is a population pyramid. Again, it's males on the left, females on the right, and just the structure of it. So they don't have a lot of young people. They have a lot more older people. So you have to change around your entire system in terms of medicine, healthcare, etc. So you have to shift that. And is that a problem? Everyone said that rapid growth was a problem. But then what about declining populations? And that's a question that we have to answer and discuss coming to in the future. So by the future, here's what we kind of look at in terms of our population. So right here, it says it's 7 billion. We're almost at 8 billion right now. Okay. If we have high growth, we'll have 16 billion people by 2100. Can we actually handle that? On the low end, if we actually really slow growth, which is actually happening, we might just kind of end up about 7.2 billion. That's nice. And kind of mediate that. That has issues. But the middle is probably the correct. So we're probably going to get 11 billion people by 2100. And as I mentioned in the past, when I was your age, the population got to 5 billion. And we're looking at huge increases. So how do we deal with that many people? Enough food, energy, etc. And the other thing is the future population growth is not going to be in the developed countries, places like the United States and Europe and etc. and Japan. Most of that population growth is going to happen in other countries that are relatively poor. We'll talk about that in terms of how we talk about it. But most of that population growth is going to go there. And in our next class, we'll talk about migration because that really feeds the movement of people from one place to another. Now, how do we reduce natural increase rates if we think that's important? And that's a topic that's very controversial. Do you really want to lower it, etc.? Is there good or bad about that? But we can talk about this. And so one is lower birth rates. And one of the things I'm showing up here on the right is in Peru, where they're actually talking to people about reproductive rights. On the bottom right, that's West Africa, where they're talking about family planning in a French language. So lower birth rates provide things like contraception, etc. So family planning is one of those. Talk to people about planning. Economic development. This is a difficult one. Oftentimes in the past, they said, if you lower birth rates, you'll lead to economic development. But I argue that economic development leads to lower birth rates. As women enter the workforce, education, etc., they delay having children, and that lowers the birth rates. And that leads into empowerment of women. So access to education, the workforce, etc., delays having children and changes that up. And so that's something where I think that sometimes they thought development will lead to it, but actually I think empowerment of women leads to lower birth rates. And increasing death rates, I'm not suggesting that, but we are seeing some of that in sub-Saharan Africa with disease we'll talk about. So here's a couple of places where they did family planning policies. And the first one was in 1952 after India became independent, and they started their own family planning program. And what they did was it was kind of top down, hierarchical, where you had kind of a main one and you had to meet quotas, and that really became problematic, where it got a really bad name. So you'd have somebody that was, I'm in charge of family planning in this community, this area, and then they would try to find ways to lower the birth rates. And what they often did was sterilization. They'd sterilize men and women, and they would go into prisons or homeless people and set, and they'd meet their quota. And it turned into a big backlash. It didn't work. But today, they've changed that to working on women's education. So they'll take women from a community, they'll train them in basically first aid and all those things, as well as family planning. They go back to the community, and then they do it, and that actually has had positive results. So top down was the first one that didn't work, but focusing on bottom up and empowering women actually related to positive outcomes. So this is India in 1995, the population pyramid. If you look at this, if it's a pyramid, that's growing fast. So from 1952 on till 1995, there was no impact on their population growth. It just kept growing. Here it is in 2022. So you see this, that's a pyramid. Here we see they're turned a corner. And that's when they changed their policies to actually empowering women and empowering, yeah. And so when it starts flattening out like this, that means they've turned the corner and it's going to go to more negative. So one thing, China is the most populous country in the world, but India is going to pass it very quickly. Probably, I think they might have done it already, but the growth is slowing. China, leading up till the 1970s, they promoted more growth. They wanted more children. They said more Chinese children means a much more populous country and powerful country. But after Chairman Mao passed away, they changed in the late 1970s. And what they did was they passed the one-child policy in 1979. And it wasn't like you couldn't have a second child, but basically if you have one child, they'd have access to education, healthcare, etc. If you have a second child, no. And in a poor country, you couldn't afford to have a second child. So that was kind of the incentives to do so. Now, you could have a second child, but oftentimes you'd have to pay a fee. And again, that was an economic disincentive. And the results were pretty amazing. From 1950, they had a 3.6% growth rate. That's super huge. That's a huge amount of growth. But today, it's negative. Now, the problems with this obviously talked about like sex imbalances. So people would want to have a male child versus a female child, partly due to cultural issues where if you had a female child and she got married, she left to go to join the other family and you lost a child. If you had a male child, then you'd gain a daughter. And that was important in terms of future and things of that nature. We also have a sex imbalance. There's a lot more males than females, and that creates some other issues. Now, recent changes to this because they've seen these problems. And so now in China, they went, I think it was in 2018, they went to a two-child policy where you could have a second child. And then recently, they went to a third child. Now you can have 3 kids. The problem with, and also, by the way, when we're looking at this, it only was with the Han majority in urban areas. If you were in the countryside, ethnic minority, you could have a second child, so it wasn't universal. But the problem is that it's culturally now acceptable just to have one child. So how do you change that to make people want to have a second or third child? And they don't. And that's a really difficult corner to change. Once you've made it ingrained, it's hard to change that culture. We see that in places like South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, where they're trying to, have more kids, and people just don't want to. That's just normal now. So that's something to think about and discuss. So let's look at China. This is 1990. We see a huge growing population. And then right about this time period, we have the one child policy. So we see a drop. But then you have these people are still having these kids. So there's momentum built into the demographic transition. So they're still having their kids. That's 1990. Here's 2025. We went through that period that we talked about, that indentation, more, and now it's gone negative. And China is now in negative territory in terms of population growth, and they're concerned about that. Because who's going to support the elderly, right? The young people are supposed to, but there's no young people. Or less, I should say. So that relates also to family planning. We'll see this a bit more on Southeast Asia and looking at Thailand. But in terms of people using family planning, in the dark green, we see 75% and above. We see a lot of that in South America, China, and parts of Europe. But sub-Saharan Africa, no. And if you look at the little graphs on the bottom side, we see like Germany, there's only like 20% that don't use anything. Here's China, where you have a lot more family planning, different types. And then in Nigeria, 85% of people use no family planning. And that's all these different things from pills, IUDs, condoms, etc., sterilization, etc. All right, finally, we'll take a break here in a moment, but I want to throw in migration. Migration also is kind of this distance decay and kind of a diffusion model where people go from places, generally speaking, from places that are poorer to places that are richer. So the number one reason for people to migrate, while we do have things like hurricanes and tsunamis and tornadoes and all those things, the main reason though that people migrate is economic. So you can kind of see that in that way. And so we see North America and Europe and Australia as the main places that people migrate to. And they're leaving places that are economically not as well, not doing as well. So the migration transition is tied to the demographic one. We had the 5 stages, right? So basically, countries that are at stage 2 and 3, that's where population's growing fast. And that's the source of migrants. Stage 3 and 4, as well as 5, that's where the migrants go. It's a very simple model. It's going from economics. And we mentioned stage 3 because people from stage 2 will go to countries in stage 3, and those from stage 3 will go to the others. That's why they overlap. Now, looking at global migrants, people that were born in another country, we have almost 200 million people. Over that, the US receives the most, but we're a large country. You see Russia, Germany, etc. These are just numbers. But in terms of percent of people in your country that came from somewhere else, Qatar, which is a Persian Gulf country with oil wealth, and they bring a lot of people in because of that. Same with the UAE and Kuwait. You see like 87 to 70% of their population was born somewhere else. And they're coming in to work in the oil industry and the construction industry and domestic areas. Jordan is a little bit high because they get refugees from Iraq and Syria. Singapore, they have such a low population growth rate that they bring in people. Israel, as a Jewish state in the Middle East, brings in lots of migrants that come in. And again, you have Oman, Saudi Arabia, again, oil-rich countries, Switzerland and New Zealand, where they're looking for people to come in. As their population growth rates go down, they're looking for migrants to come in. And a final thing for this small bit is remittances. So people that go abroad and work, they send money home back to their place. And you can see over 600 billion, probably higher now, is sent back to their home communities, their families, their communities, etc. India is the biggest one with 71 billion. Mexico is really high with 23 billion. And places like Haiti is over 30% of their entire economy comes from money sent back from migrants that went abroad and send money back home. And we'll talk much more about that in detail in different regions as we discuss. It's good in terms of the money that goes back that could be reinvested in productive activities. But if it's just going to pay for basic, going to school and clothing and food, it just shows that that economy is not doing that well. So if it can be actually invested in something more positive, like having a school or, a shop or buying some new land, that'd be much more positive. Okay, so that was my kind of intro to cultural geography there. We'll have another one coming up soon. And I hope you enjoy and really a lot of things to think about and talk about. So I'd like to see that in your responses. Thank you.